hour or so as much as I do. So the topic of today is death. Given that I'm supposed to pretend that I'm about to die and impart my final wisdom on to you. So I thought, well, what else to talk about other than the philosophy of death? I'm a philosopher, and I'm thinking about what would happen, this is my last lecture. And I guess that's where I'll begin. I don't know what else to talk about as philosophy than philosophy. So here I go. A bit about myself, what I do and why I do it. I don't like to talk too much about myself, so I prefer to keep on thinking and invite you to think with me. So what do? I do philosophy. I'm a philosopher. That's my professional identity. What is it that I do? Well, philosophy. And what is philosophy? Well, it's gotten a lot of definitions, but I really think that it comes down to radical reflection on big, interesting, difficult questions. And there's really no limit on what questions count as philosophy questions. It just seems that the ones that happen to count as philosophy questions over time have uniformly been really hard and really, really interesting, to the point that it gets people talking for thousands and thousands of years. It just tells people never to stop talking about them. Well, I love philosophy precisely for that reason. Ethics is my specialty within philosophy, and ethics is simply the philosophy of morality and value. Ethics deals with questions like how should I treat others, what things in life should I pursue, what things in life should I avoid, and really more generally, how should I live in general as a human being. Now, why is it that I do ethics? Some people ask me. Well, I'm not the only person who does ethics. I'm not one of elite, professional class that does ethics. Everybody does ethics. I do ethics because ethics is inevitable. I am constantly faced with ethical questions about how should I treat others, how I should live my life. And really, so are you. You're constantly faced with ethical questions. I consider it a mission in my life to reveal that to you, reveal that fact to you, that you are constantly facing ethical questions, how you ought to live, how you should interact with others. And I just want to give you the tools to help you think through those questions. So I'm supposed to pretend this is my last lecture. What would I say to you? Well, like I said, I want to talk to you about death. And I think there's a lot to be gained from thinking about death. Not just, to feel deep and to feel, like macho or whatever, but we can learn a lot about thinking about death because it's a good way to actually learn what the right way to live is. Like, if you want to know how best to live, it's a good exercise to think, well, what happens if you die? What happens if you lose your life? In what way is that a bad thing, if it's a bad thing at all? And I've thought a lot about death. I don't know why. I've always been attracted to that topic, among other ethical questions. And I'm not really troubled by the thought of my coming death. It was a long time before I realized the reasoning, behind that sense. And the person that expressed the reasoning behind my nonchalance about death is the Greek philosopher Epicurus. So I want to share with you Epicurus' arguments that death is nothingness. Death can't be bad for the person who dies. I'm much more troubled about something else, which is the possibility of not living well. I think that we tend to confuse the fear of death with the fear of not living well. Those are two very different things. I want to try to distinguish those things for you tonight. So this is what I'll argue in my last lecture. I'll argue first that we die when our bodies cease to exist, which means that our existence is relatively brief. You won't be living much longer than a few more decades. in and of itself is not something that we have reason to fear, because death is not something that is bad for the person who dies. On the other hand, though, we do have reasons to fear perhaps some consequences associated with death. And one consequence in particular associated with death is that we do have reason to fear is we have reason to fear not being valuable lives. I'll conclude by giving you the message that life is of value, sure, okay? And when you lose your life, something of value is extinguished. But there are many other values, more values than life itself. And there may even be more significant values, more important values than life itself. I can't resist, but I just want to contrast what I'm going to do tonight to what Socrates did more than 2 millennia ago. Socrates was an ancient Greek philosopher who was condemned to death for corrupting the youth of Athens through his philosophy, and he, at his execution, the depiction of his execution, was forced to drink some hemlock, some poison, and that would kill him. But there's a great piece of philosophy written by Socrates' student, Plato, in which this scene is dramatized. And Socrates is trying to console the students who love him and are surrounding him and are in despair because he's about to die. He's trying to say, don't worry. There's nothing to fear about death, because death is really just an illusion. We are immortal, in fact, and the soul will go on to live forever. So I don't really die. I'll just sort of relocate in a way, and my soul will live forever. And then, the students were convinced of this argument. They said things like, this makes sense, and I feel much better. We don't have so much reason to be sad. Well, I have kind of a different message than Socrates. So my message is not that we're immortal. Actually, we're very mortal, and that we will die with our bodies. But still, you don't have so much to fear from that. Okay? So the message is the same. You don't have so much to fear from death, but you're not immortal. That's where I differ from Socrates. So what is death? I'll understand death simply as the cessation of existence. Okay? Your death will occur when you no longer exist, and that will come at some moment in the future. And of course, this moment when you no longer exist will come after prior moments when you did exist. So that's what distinguishes your death from your birth. Before you came into existence, you didn't exist. And then if we define death this way, we can ask, well, do we ever die, really? Do we ever cease to exist? And if so, when do we die? And I'm sure you're all very familiar with the view that not just some, but a lot of people hold, which is that there's an afterlife. And in fact, after your bodily death, after your body ceases to exist, there is something, whether we call it a soul, whether we call it a spirit, that continues to exist. So on this view, this belief in the afterlife, you don't die with your body. You continue on. Only your body ceases to exist. And that was Socrates' view too. Now, a lot of people find this view very comforting, but I don't think that there's very good reason to believe it's true, and actually I think there are many good reasons to think it's false. So I'm going to go ahead and provide you just a brief argument as to why I don't think that there is any such thing as an afterlife. Nevertheless, we don't have much reason to fear, even if that's so. So here's my argument. It's pretty simple. The first premise says, there has to be an argument. Socrates literally gave his last lecture with an argument. Wasn't reminiscing about a war story. He gave an argument, so that's going to be. The first premise is, without a body, there is no consciousness. Without your body, there is no consciousness. So what does that mean? Consciousness is, you might say, an activity that involves a lot of different things. It involves perceiving the world around you, trees and mountains. It involves remembering the past. It involves reasoning, thinking through a practical problem or problem on a test. It involves deciding things, and it involves acts of will, wanting, willing yourself to do something, make something happen. So all those activities fall under the umbrella of consciousness, and we are all conscious beings. By virtue of having the ability to engage in these activities, we are conscious beings. Now I want to suggest that without a body, and especially without a brain, one cannot have consciousness. And the reason for that is quite simple. It is that all the elements of consciousness, reason, feeling, and willing, are things that can be disrupted, damaged, and even controlled by manipulation or damage to the brain. So here are a few findings from psychology and neuroscience, which do seem to indicate that consciousness depends on having a brain. Alcohol and drugs are very well known to cause degeneration of neural activity, activity in your brain, electrical activity in your brain. And these narcotics can impair, cripple, or even completely destroy your ability to think rationally. People who have extreme and chronic alcoholism also experience mental decline. They aren't able to solve problems or think through coherent thoughts as well as healthy. There are also numerous emotion controlling chemicals. These are chemicals that are actually used by psychiatrists to treat mental illness. Lithium, salts, cocaine, some are illegal narcotics. And all these drugs take effect on a person's consciousness. Probably the most famous one is LSD, which can cause hallucinations, can cause flashbacks that seem to be quite real to the person experiencing them. And the point is that chemicals can have a very dramatic impact on your consciousness. And finally, another point to be made is that consciousness is quite vulnerable to other purely physical events like sharp blows to the head. You can lose consciousness as a result of that, or you can see spots. Okay? Your perceptions can be altered by purely physical event happening within your body or some kind of blunt force trauma to your head. To develop the point even further, we're pretty familiar with diseases and disabilities that affect consciousness, and all these diseases and disabilities are brain-based. Can be attributed to some kind of a dysfunction or damage to a person's brain. Here you have a list on the slides. Just to pick a couple, there's one condition called hemi-neglect, in which physical lesions in the brain have been associated with the complete loss of awareness of the left half of the victim's universe, including their own body. So you have to imagine that the left half of your entire visual field and your entire field of awareness is just gone, and you can only sense the right part. Okay, that's called hemi-neglect. And this is caused by physical lesions, damage to the brain. Another condition is known as blind sight. And blind sight is something that happens when a victim is only aware of their, one or the other side of their body. So maybe a victim might dress only the right side of his body, and they will completely disavow anything having to do with the left side of their own body. So they might even say, I don't even know who the owner of this arm is, because that's like the left arm. So it's like, who's that? But the right, they'll interact with in a normal way. This too is a condition that's associated with physical regions in the brain. The point being, again, that consciousness depends on the brain, and we know this because damage to the brain, physical manipulation of the brain can alter consciousness or destroy it in different ways. Here's a really kind of entertaining story. The story of Phineas Gage. I don't know if you've heard it before. I talked about it in the ethics class. But it's another fairly dramatic instance of how a person's consciousness and maybe even their own identity depends on their physical body, particularly their brain. So I'll just play you a little biographical video on this page.
Back in 1848, there was a pretty ordinary man who had an extraordinary accident. You've probably heard of Phineas Gage, the railroad foreman who had a 1-meter iron rod blasted through his skull. The details are pretty graphic. Think bits of brains and skull going everywhere. This is my friend Anna from Gross Science, who's here to take you through all the gory details.
Part of Gage's job constructing railroads was to sprinkle dynamite into plastic holes. One afternoon, he tamped the iron rod down into a hole filled with dynamite, and it blasted off into his head. It passed through his left cheek, behind his left eye, through his frontal lobe, and out the top of his head, landing 8 meters away. Medical records suggest he was conscious for the entire time. He went to see a physician who stuck his fingers on either side of the wound to pick out pieces of loose brain and skull. But it wasn't so clear-cut. His brain developed a fungal infection, and his physician had to puncture tissue in Gage's nose to drain the wound.
Okay, another view. Miraculously, Gage survived this massive head injury and he appeared normal. He could still talk, walk, and function as he did before. But those who knew him said Gage was no longer Gage. He was rude and impatient. The rod had penetrated his frontal lobes, responsible for higher mental functions like social behavior and planning. And Gage could have had what we now know as frontal lobe disorder. Although we don't have a lot of evidence about Gage's story. Only a few doctors' reports are published in medical journals. Some say his behavioral changes are grossly exaggerated. But those medical reports did contribute to modern neurology. They supported emerging theories that our cerebral functions were localized and that certain conditions could be linked to brain damage. More recent study in people with brain lesions suggests that the orbital frontal lobe, part of Gage's brain that was damaged, is super important in decision making. And in 2012, researchers reconstructed scans of Gage's 189-year-old skull to show that most damage was to his frontal lobe. But the passage of the rod would have interrupted the connectivity of many different brain areas, making Gage's behavioral changes similar to those suffering from Alzheimer's disease.
But brain injuries don't just come from trauma, they can come from diseases too. Check out Gross Science, where Anna explains how the herpes...
All right. You need to hear about herpes right now. But yeah, this is a really important case, and it actually was a forerunner to more modern cases that came to be studied by the neuroscientist Antonio Damasio. Damasio kind of got interested in this Phineas Gage case because Gage's symptoms were very similar to some patients that he was studying who also experienced damage to the same frontal part of the brain. It was later specified as the ventral medial prefrontal cortex, like right here. And he, in particular, had one patient who called Elliot, who underwent brain surgery to that part of the brain. It was damaged. And like Gage, Elliot was just never the same. His life was, in effect, ruined. He couldn't even make basic decisions like what to eat from a restaurant menu or what pen to use or when to schedule a meeting. He made some very foolish investments and lost a lot of money. His wife left him. He started to spend time with a woman that his family disapproved of, and he lost his job because he couldn't really get along with people, just like Gage. And it seems that all of these changes to Eliot's persona really started with the damage that he experienced to that particular part of his brain. Again, the point here is just a person's capacity to reason, capacity to think, to feel, it all depend on your well-functioning brain. And here's another story, the story of Clive Waring. And it's actually a quite tragic story. Clive Waring is a British man who suffered an attack of viral encephalitis that destroyed almost all of his hippocampus, which is the region in the brain that processes and stores new information in memory. So this left him without the ability to form new memories. He literally had no short-term memory after that suffering from that disease. So I'll now play a short video on Waring's story.
One man is consigned to live entirely within the present with terrible consequences. Clive Waring has the worst case of amnesia ever known. 20 years ago, he lost his memory, and now his wife, Deborah, is the only person he recognizes.
Really only has less than 30 seconds memory, and sometimes it's as little as perhaps 7 seconds. It's as little as a sentence.
I'm going to see your sister Adele. Her daughter's got married recently
I see.
in New Zealand,
Ah,
and so they're having a party.
funny how the ladies acquire different titles when they get married.
Do you know who I'm going to see tomorrow?
Buckingham Palace.
No, really guess.
I don't know.
You don't know? Adele.
I
Do you know where I'm going?
No.
She's having a party at her house tomorrow.
It's her birthday.
No.
Mm.
Do you know why?
No.
It's to do with her daughter.
No, I see.
Do you know why her daughter's having a party?
No.
Guess.
No, I don't.
She just got married.
Oh, I see.
She just got married in, do you know what country she just got married in?
No.
In New Zealand.
Oh, I see.
The sentence he is in, he will probably have forgotten the sentence before. You ask him a question, and he'll give you an answer, but while he's giving you the answer, he's already forgotten the question. That's how short it is.
I'm going to see your kids tomorrow.
You see my kids?
Yeah, your children.
What are they up to now?
Do you know what they're up to now? Guess what you think they're up to?
No, I don't guess. I don't know what their O-levels were. They haven't got an O-level last time I was constant. So I don't know what possible thing they could do they?
Yeah.
No, I couldn't possibly guess.
Where do you think they are?
No, I don't know. So where I am.
All he has is void behind him.
It's been like death. I've never seen a human being before. Never had a dream or a thought. The brain has been totally inactive. Day and night the same. No thoughts at all. As far as I'm concerned, the doctors have been totally incompetent. I've never seen a doctor the whole time.
That's a very musical kiss. I'm dizzy. I don't know which part 3 I'm studying.
In case you're wondering why he gets so excited when he sees his wife, is that he forgets that she was just in the room. So whenever she re-enters the room, it's like he hasn't seen her in years, and he gets really excited, even though it was just a few minutes since she was there. His short-term memory is so impaired that he can't remember what happened even a few seconds before. And this is a result of a brain disease. Okay? Memory is supposed to be part of your consciousness. No if there's damage to the right part of the brain, this is what can happen to memory. This is what can happen to consciousness. Consciousness is destroyed when your brain is destroyed. So that completes my case for that first one. Without the body, specifically without your brain, there is no consciousness. And the next point I want to make is that, well, without consciousness, there is no you. What do I mean? Well, imagine that your consciousness was permanently destroyed. This is a thought experiment. So think of how you are now. And then imagine that you had no perceptions of the world around you. So imagine that you can see or you can hear anything, you can feel anything, you can taste anything. Imagine next that you have no memories, even of the instant that just occurred. Imagine that you have no emotions at all. No feeling of love, no happiness. Imagine that you have no thoughts of any kind, you have no ideas that pass through your mind. And you have no desires at all. Subtract all of those things. And what's left? What's left when all those elements are gone? Well, it doesn't seem like there's anything left of you. And even if there were something left over, I would hesitate to say that that something is you. Maybe matter, but it wouldn't be you. Without consciousness, there is nothing. So that brings me to my conclusion, which is that when your body ceases to exist, so do you. Without body, there's no consciousness. Without consciousness, there's no you. Now, maybe eventually, one day, if you watch a lot of sci-fi movies, it'll be discovered that we can transfer our consciousness into other material. So there are a lot of movies about this. I don't know, most recent one would be on Chappie, the robot gangster has nunchucks. Anyway, but it's also a movie about the possibility that we might be able to transfer consciousness, into new material like a robot. So maybe that's happening. Maybe that's possible, but that hasn't happened yet, and I wouldn't count on that happening before you're dead. So you're gonna have to face up to the very real possibility, which I think is most likely the case, that your existence will end with your bodily death. Okay. Well, that's my argument, and not an argument. We have a good argument. Let's get objections to your argument. So let's consider some objections to my argument. My first premise was, with no body, there is no consciousness. All right. Well, am I really entitled to that? Some people report so-called out-of-body experiences, where they're able to have conscious states apart from their body. And these experiences can come when a person is near death or clinically dead for a brief time and then revives. Their heart stops and then it revives. So these experiences have been reported at least. Could they be evidence that we don't need to have a body to be conscious? Could they be evidence that we could have consciousness without the body? A lot of these reports are really quite amazing. They describe a person levitating over their body, and maybe encountering dead relatives, and seeing some kind of a passageway, perhaps the next life or an afterlife of some sort. And it's very compelling. They're all very compelling stories. You almost wish that they're true. But some experiments have been done to try to corroborate these stories. Remember I said that in some of these stories, the person that reports levitating over their body and then seeing their body from above, and maybe if they're in a hospital, doctors working on their body. So in some cases, researchers have actually put secret numbers behind light fixtures hanging from ceilings. So you can imagine maybe I put a secret number on the top of that light fixture. And the simple idea is that, look, if someone's consciousness really did levitate above the body, well, they would see from above that light, and they would be able to read the number. And this has actually happened where a person said, yeah, I levitated above my body, and I could see the light fixture, and I could see all the people working on it. And they were asked, well, did you see the number? And they're like, what number? No, they didn't see the number. They didn't notice it. So this has happened. If there really was a consciousness that levitated above the body, they probably would have noticed the number. It's kind of an odd thing. A number stuck to the back of the light fixture. Another, maybe more compelling piece of research done on out-of-body experiences suggests that even these out-of-body experiences are dependent on the brain and are in fact illusory. So one group claims to have been able to induce out-of-body experiences in living people by electrically stimulating one particular portion of the brain, usually the right angular gyrus. And so they're able to induce these experiences at will just by stimulating that particular part of the brain. Okay. In living people who have otherwise well-functioning bodies. So I don't think that out-of-body experiences provide very compelling evidence for the idea that we can have consciousness without the body. Another objection comes against that second premise. The second premise in the argument is that with no consciousness, there's no you. And you might have thought this is kind of obvious. People can temporarily lose consciousness, but when they do that, they don't temporarily cease to exist, right? You might be knocked out, hopefully it won't be, but you might, but you won't suddenly cease to exist and then come back into existence when you revive. So it seems like you can exist, without being conscious. But I think, we have to be very careful about what it means for a person to have consciousness. A person can have consciousness in various ways. And I would like to be specific about the way in which you need to have consciousness in order for you to exist. So one way to have consciousness is just to be conscious, as opposed to being unconscious. Right? Another way to have consciousness is to have the ability to be conscious. So even if you're temporarily knocked unconscious, well, your brain retains the ability to be conscious. It just needs some time for that ability to start working again. But if you lack the ability to be conscious due to, say, perhaps extreme damage to your brain, that's the sense in which having consciousness. That's the sense in which having consciousness is necessary for there to be you. Only having the ability to be conscious is necessary for your existence. So that if you actually did lack consciousness, the ability to be conscious, if you actually did lack the ability to form thoughts, to form feelings, to have perceptions, if you lack all those things, to have memories, then it really does seem like there wouldn't be you. So yes, I agree that if you temporarily lost consciousness, you wouldn't cease to exist. But if you temporarily lost your ability to be conscious at all, I don't think there would be any of you left. Final point I want to make about the afterlife is that I just don't really think that there's a good reason to believe in it. I think we have a really great source of evidence as to what it would be like after we die. And that's what it was like before we're born. What's going on before you're born? Well, before you're born, you had no body and you had no consciousness, and your brain didn't exist yet. There's no really good reason to think the situation would be different after your body dies. No body, no consciousness, no you. In the same way it was before you were born, it's the same situation after you were born. And there's no reason to think about those. So you have an excellent idea, I think, of what it would be like after your body dies. What was it like before you were born? There was nothing. Okay. That's what it would be like. So, in light of all this, should we kind of despair, fall to our knees in a world of nothingness and loneliness? No. I don't think so. I don't think death is something that we should fear, even if we will die. And the reason is that death is not something that is bad for the person who dies. So let me explain that. And as I go through this explanation, I'm going to make a pretty basic assumption. The assumption is just something is bad for you only if it's harmful. I think that makes a bit of sense. Like something can't even harm you, it wouldn't be bad for you, right? So this argument is directly inspired by Greek philosopher Epicurus. Epicurus famously contended death is harmless to the person who dies. And he wrote famously, death is nothing to us. Okay? Our life has no terrors. For him, it was thoroughly understood that there are no terrors. And ceasing to live, basically that means that there's nothing to fear from death, because when you die, there's just no more you. So there's nothing to fear when death, when you understand that death cannot harm you. So here's how the argument goes. The first premise will say, something harms you only if it causes you to suffer. Okay. If something harms you, it's got to cause you to suffer somehow. Maybe it gives you pain. The second premise says, something causes you to suffer only at times when you exist. Like you can't suffer without existing. If you didn't exist, there would be nothing there to experience that suffering. The third premise says, at the time of your death, you cease to exist. We discussed that before, my argument against the afterlife. So a couple of conclusions follow from this. Death cannot cause you to suffer. Okay? If death can cause you to suffer, well, death can't harm you. Pretty simple. And I think quite profound. Now you might already have in mind a few objections. One objection would be to line 4. Objection is to the statement that death cannot cause you to suffer. Well, come on, I mean, obviously being murdered viciously or dying from a painful disease can cause you to suffer, and those are forms of dying, so death can cause you to suffer, contrary to what Epicurus would say. But Epicurus, he's got something very specific in mind by death. Okay? Death, for Epicurus, refers to the particular moment that you cease to exist. Okay? Being viciously murdered, dying of painful diseases, these aren't moments when you cease to exist. So they're not forms of death. Okay? They're rather processes that result in your death. And of course, a process that results in your death, that occurs before the point that you cease to exist, can cause you to suffer. And those processes can be very bad for you. They can harm you a lot. But the point of your death, the point that you cease to exist, that can't harm you. Another objection against the idea that death can cause you to suffer. So the idea would be, well, even if death doesn't cause me to suffer, the expectation of death does, so my death causes me to suffer. Well, Epicurus thinks that this is silly, actually. He thinks that fearing death is foolish and unnecessary. And this is what he says in a famous letter to Menocius. He says, foolish, therefore, is the person who says that he fears death, not because it will pain when it comes, but because it pains in the prospect. Whatever causes no annoyance when it is present causes only a groundless pain in the expectation. So the idea is that given death is harmful to you, given that death is not harmful to you, there's no reason to fear death. And if you realize this, you can convince yourself not to fear death anymore. Okay? Fearing death is foolish because you don't exist at the point when you die, and there will be no suffering. Okay? So it can't harm you. So there's no reason to fear it. Okay? So get rid of that fear of the expectation of death. it's sort of silly to fear other non-harmful things. It would be silly for me to, fear that chair. That's foolish. That's unnecessary, right? Now why? Well, because the chair can do me no harm. Well, similarly, according to Epicurus, death can do me no harm. So it would be foolish and unnecessary to fear that. Okay. One other objection, and I think actually this one gets traction against Epicurus, but I'll explain later what I mean by that. So this objection says, when I die, my loved ones will grieve my death. They will suffer in their grief, and if they suffer, I will too. So my death will cause me to suffer. Okay. And Epicurus would say this, no. Okay. Even if your loved ones suffer when you're dead because they're grieving you, you will not. Okay. There's a big difference between your suffering and other people's suffering. Okay. And something that causes you to suffer only at times that you exist. At the time that you die, you cease to exist. So at the time of your death, the suffering of your loved ones cannot cause you to suffer. So, yeah, your loved ones, sure, they might be really suffering, but don't confuse that with your suffering. You won't be suffering when you're dead. Okay, you'll be non-existent. Okay. One last objection, and I think this is really getting to a point where we can learn something valuable from Epicurus, apart from death not being complicated. So the objection goes: even if the suffering of your loved ones doesn't cause you to suffer, the expectation of their suffering does. Of course, Epicurus would just say the same thing that he would say against the objection that your expectation of death causes you to suffer. He'd say, well, that's foolish, that's unnecessary, you don't have to suffer from the expectation of death, you don't have to suffer from the expectation of the suffering of your loved ones, because once you're dead, you won't have the capacity to suffer anymore, you will be non-existent. So it's irrational to fear what will happen at a point where you no longer exist. That's what Epicurus might say. But there, I think Epicurus makes a mistake. He says something like, given that the suffering of your loved ones after your death is harmless to you, there's no reason to fear the suffering of your loved ones after you die. Okay? And if you know that, your fear will go away. He actually, I think Epicurus is wrong here. So he's correct, I think, as far as thinking death is not bad for the person who dies. And that's comforting, you don't have to worry too much about what will happen to you when you die. But it's not really that comforting because, contrary to Epicurus, the fear of death isn't totally foolish. Even if your death is not bad for you, there are still reasons to fear it. Okay? So I think Epicurus makes a mistake here. He assumes that, well, there are only reasons to fear things that are bad for you. But I don't see any reason to accept that. I think that there are plenty of reasons to fear other things. And I think that the grounds for a rational fear of death has much to teach us about living well, about living a good life. So the reasons to fear death, I think, really have nothing to do with it. Okay? Death is not bad for you. I'm convinced by Epicurus going that far. But rather, there are still reasons to fear death that relate to what may happen to others and what may happen to the world you leave behind. I think if we think about those reasons to fear death that don't solely relate to your own well-being, okay, you'll realize that there are values, there are good and bad things, there are things that matter, that go far beyond your own life and your own well-being. I think that's a really important lesson. I think we really have to understand that there are good things and there are bad things that aren't necessarily good or bad for you. So I can give you this brief argument that indeed there are bad things that aren't bad for you. And I think one of those things that are bad, though not bad for you, is the suffering that your loved ones will feel when you die. Why? Because, well, whether or not it harms you, seems to me that there's a clear reason to fear the suffering of your loved ones. You have a child who depends on you and will have more hardship in life after you die. I think there's definitely reason to fear that, okay, even if you will no longer exist after you die. And if there's reason to fear the suffering of your loved ones after you die, then of course the suffering of your loved ones is a bad thing. Okay? If there's reason to fear it, it seems like there's only good reason to fear that which is bad. So the suffering of your loved ones after you die is a bad thing. But importantly, it's a bad thing whether or not it's harmful to you personally. Now, something is bad for you, I assume, only if it harms you. So some things are bad whether or not they're bad for you. So it's a pretty simple argument, right? There are some things that are bad that will happen even after your existence ends, which you have reason to fear. There are some things which are bad, even though they're not bad. Okay? And you might wonder, well, is there any reason to fear anything else besides harming yourself and the suffering of your loved ones? And I think the answer is clearly yes. It seems like we do have reason to fear a lot of things, even after we die. We have to fear suffering in general due to disease and poverty and violence. We have reason to fear the decline of the natural environment. We have reason to fear the loss of good things like knowledge and art and music and literature. These are all things that we have reason to fear because they are things that matter. They are values, and they can either be good things or bad things. We have reason to fear some things because they're bad, suffering. We have reason to avoid those things. But we also have reasons to fear the absence or loss of other things which are good, like the loss of the natural environment. But how can this be? How can there be values other than the value of your own well-being and your love? It seems like, oh yeah, really obvious that it's bad when I'm hurt, or my mother or father is harmed. That I guess because of the creatures we are, it's something that strikes us as obviously bad. More distant things, the suffering of people we don't know, strangers, the suffering in the loss of the environment. Well, maybe it's not so easy to recognize those as bad things, but I think if we reflect on it a little bit more deeply, it would be quite apparent that these are all truly bad things that are and good things that are bad and good independently of you and your own well-being, your own interests. So we can reflect on the matter, I think, in this way. I find it most productive to do this. You can start from a relatively firm starting point, which is your reasons to avoid the suffering of yourself and the suffering of your loved ones. And maybe your reasons to pursue your own well-being and the well-being of your loved ones. So it seems that it's pretty clear that you have those kinds of reasons. But I think if you start from there, it would be easy to identify pretty similar reasons to avoid the suffering of humanity in general. Maybe not even just humanity, all sentient conscious beings. And you could also identify very similar reasons to pursue well-being several very similar reasons to similar reasons to pursue artistic achievements and literary greatness. So the point here would be that the reasons to avoid or pursue things are not just limited to anything that's unique to you or anyone else. So just to go back to my the starting point, right? The firm starting point. My reason to say prevent the suffering of my own mother. Okay, yeah. I think we would all be pretty inclined to agree we have such a reason. Now, why do we have that reason? What gives me and what gives you the reason to prevent the suffering of our mothers? Well, I don't think that we can identify anything unique about our mothers or about ourselves that gives us the reason to prevent the suffering of our mother. Instead, it seems that the reasons that I have to prevent my mother's suffering just stem from the fact that she can suffer, and that I have the power to help her rather than hurt her, and that her care is something that should be reciprocated. So these are not factors that have anything special, especially to do with me or to do with her, my identity, her identity. These are features that other people besides my mother can have as well. Other people can suffer. Other people are people that I have the power to help or hurt in my actions. Other people may care for me in a way that should be reciprocated. So the point here is that the reasons I have to prevent my mother's suffering are also just as well reasons to prevent the suffering of other people, not limited to my mother, and some of them may be reasons to prevent the suffering of humanity in general, or maybe even all conscious beings. Now I have this screenshot here on the slide because it's from the website of Evidence Action, which allows you to look at the potential impact of a charitable donation in fighting global disease and poverty. You can enter in whatever number you like in US dollars for your donation and see what it can do, what that donation could do for people in the world. So with the $100 US, it says here, I could have the effect of deworming 1,000 children, saving lives potentially from worm-related diseases. I could provide safe water to 119 community members for, it says, 1 year. I could also channel money to improve testing and research on effective poverty interventions. So these are really quite dramatic impacts that I could have on other people in this world for a relatively small amount of money. This is not a very large donation at all. It's it's something I can easily afford to do. And if what I was arguing before makes any sense, if it's true that I have very strong reasons not only to prevent the suffering of my mother, but also to prevent the suffering of humanity in general, this is exactly what I should give that $100, just by virtue of the fact that I can have such a positive impact. Okay? And forget about what it makes me feel like. I feel like a good guy. That's a good benefit. But even if I didn't feel like a good guy, even if I felt like, I'd rather buy something with that $100, I would still have a really good reason to give the $100 away. I think all these thoughts can be summed up by a quote from English philosopher William Godwin, who kind of asked a rhetorical question. He said, "What magic is there in the pronoun my that should justify us in overturning the decisions of impartial truth?" And the answer that Godwin had in mind is that there isn't any magic in the pronoun my. There is nothing magic about your well-being, about your life, that makes your well-being in your life more important than anyone else's life. Okay. So here's some final thoughts. You might at the end of this think, if we're all going to, cease to exist when we die, doesn't that mean that just nothing matters? Doesn't that mean that there are no values at all? There's a poem from Percy Shelley in which that thought is expressed. You have to imagine just a great empire that's now in ruins. And it seems like once it's in ruins, there's nothing to it. There's nothing valuable about it. The universe might, according to some theories, end in a great heat death, where the stars will all burn out and they'll collapse into black holes, and the black holes will even dissipate, and the universe will just be lifeless and cold with no matter in it. So, according to some theories, at some point there really will be no more existence at all, at least no life in existence. So does that mean that nothing matters? Some people say this, but I think that's obviously not true, because there are things that are valuable which have a temporary existence. So, think about experiences in your life that seem obviously to be valuable experiences that ended, right? The first time riding your bike. It's a special experience, right? Something that, even though is now over, continues to have some kind of value, something that matters. Friendships and relationships, they don't last forever, but they still, play a role in your life and your development, and it's worth calling them things that matter, things that are valuable. The lives of dead people, okay, the lives of people who no longer exist are also quite obviously valuable. We don't have to wait to see whether there is an afterlife to be able to know whether the lives of dead people are valuable. And I think there's a good reason for that, and it's because the lives of those dead people have value independently of how long-lasting they are. You don't have to wait to see how long-lasting a person's life is to know that a dead person's life is a valuable thing. So no, death doesn't make nothing. So I'll just conclude now. How should we feel about death? Well, I don't think that death per se is something that we should fear, because it's not harmful to you. Okay? Untimely death, though, could interfere with things that matter in your life, relationships and pursuits that make your life valuable. So there are reasons perhaps to fear a possible consequence of death, but that's not the same as death itself. And in light of your reasons to fear this possible consequence of death, possible disruption to the pursuit of things that matter, I think we have to draw a very important lesson, which is that you can decrease your reasons to fear your own death, as long as you live a life that's richly filled with values, richly filled with things that matter. The more value that you have in your life, the less reason you have to fear that you'll leave behind a world that's devoid of value, or a world that doesn't have as much value as it could have had if you had done more. So thanks. My final message to you is just, life is not the only thing that matters. There are more values than merely life itself. I appreciate your attention. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Prof. Luco, for a very engaging lecture. Before we call it a day, I would actually like to call upon our USP Club President, Anyway, to present a token of appreciation to Prof. Luco.
This might be my last lecture for the USPs, because I don't know if I'll ever be called upon to teach USPs again. I must say, though, it's a real privilege to be able to, just share time with this group and to read your thoughts and to hear your thoughts in class. It's something that I really miss, and I was, really touched to be able to have that opportunity. So thank you so much. Yeah.
Q&A?
Sure. Yeah.
No questions?
That happens so often.
Guys, any questions for Prof. Luco?
Is anybody afraid of dying? Yeah.
Can I ask, for you, what are the reasons for you not to die now?
What are my reasons not to die? It's like, why not commit suicide? Yeah, I think, like I was trying to say, there are things that are worth living for. There are values that I can realize through continuing to live. And even if I pass out of existence, it will still be a fact that my life contains these things that are worth living for. And as long as I can, I will continue to pursue those things that are worth living for, so that I can, bring more value to the world. I think that's a reasonable thing to do. So yeah, I guess if you have the opportunity to stay alive, I guess we all have the ability to end it. And say, well, think of all the reasons that you have to continue to live, and there are a lot of reasons that don't just, end with your own well-being and your own interests and so on. There are, reasons to act in the world that go far beyond your particular life. Ending suffering in general, preserving the environment, promoting cultural achievements. These are things that can that matter and that go well beyond your own. So, teaching philosophy is something that I think, wow, I can't stop doing. Oh, hi.
Yeah, would you say that fear of death is actually good because it's actually a survival mechanism for human beings or for organisms? Kind of like it's the thing that stops us from jaywalking without checking for traffic, things like that. So it's like it helps us survive. It's part of the instinct.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. Yeah. But I mean, I suppose we shouldn't turn it into something that should, that impair us, that would impair our ability to live healthy lives, I think some people, especially older people that I talk to, people in my family, they really become, I suppose, obsessed, with the question of like what's going to happen when I die, will I be okay, and so on. I think that's probably unhealthy. It just gets in the way of doing things that matter, right? I don't think that there's much reason to feel what will become of you after you die. So, at least when it comes to that, I think it's not rational to fear death so much. But just to have this kind of reflex that keeps you from, from falling off a cliff, sure, but that's not the same as having like a phobia that impairs your ability to live well. And that's the kind of fear of death that I'm hoping that we let go of. Mabel?
Yeah, there are more values than life itself, but I think like some of us would like to know what are the important values that
Yeah. Well, I don't really think that there's anything beyond happiness and avoidance of suffering that really we have reason to say is valuable. So I put other things on the list like, preserving the natural environment, literary works, and so on. But I guess if I was pushed, I would say that those things are valuable only insofar as they promote happiness and they, alleviate suffering. I don't know what value could be if it wasn't something like that sentient beings that provokes a response in sentient beings. So things that are valuable in virtue of provoking some kind of a response in beings that have consciousness. So I think if there were no conscious beings, there would be no value in first. Yeah. So I guess the most important thing then is to preserve the root of all value, which is preserve sentient life. And one of those things that you can do is actually to spend a small amount of your income to have a huge impact on the struggle against lethal poverty. People are dying in thousands by the day just because of avoidable poverty-related causes. You have actually an extraordinary power to prevent those poverty-related deaths from happening. I heard recently that there was this group, Give Well, and what it does is it assesses the positive impact of charities, and they have estimated that it only takes about $300 to $3,000 in a donation to potentially save a person's life. It depends on which intervention you're using, but we're not talking about a lot of money. $300 to $3,000 to save a person's life, which is less money than people spend on suits and designer clothing. So that's something that you can clearly do to have a life that is rich in value.
Yeah, I can't think of a better way to phrase this, so I'll ask it in this way. So, before the end of your life, what would you want to be remembered, or what value would you want to create? So, what we want to be remembered by in the case?
Yeah. Why is this interesting to you? I don't know. I guess I think. Well, I would think I'd like to create a lot of different kinds of value. I do spend less than 1% of my income to combat global poverty and disease, and I want to just increase that. There are some people who spend 50%. I don't know if I can get to that level, but I think it's worth a try. And I think I could get to at least 10% in charitable donations, and still live quite comfortably. So that's one thing that I'm kind of working toward right now. When you're younger, you kind of have to, you have to hedge against risks. But as I get into a more stable situation, and I feel like I can take more risks with my income, that's what I would like to do. I would just like to be there with. But other things too, hopefully writing a good paper in philosophy that gets people thinking once in a while, hopefully teaching a good course that gets people thinking, and hopefully changing the way people behave by virtue, the message that I get across to you. So I hope that maybe when you're on your deathbed, you will think back to this lecture, and you'll just remind yourself that you shouldn't be afraid. Think about how you lived your life, and as long as you live a full life, rich in value, rich in things that matter, there's really nothing. Oh, yeah.
Somebody said that things are only valuable if you don't have them.
Yeah.
But at the same time, protecting other sentient beings is also valuable. But what if you want to dedicate your life to protecting the well-being of other sentient beings, and maybe reduce poverty?
Yeah.
But it brings you a lot of stress, so it doesn't bring happiness. So how do you balance these two conflicting possibilities?
Yeah, I've got a Eureka student who's working on this problem, and I'm learning a lot from her. I think she's persuaded me about how to balance them. Her view is kind of radical. I don't know if I could live up to it, but her view is that you should really push yourself to the point that if you were to give any more, in service of other sentient beings, you would actually make the total well-being in the world lower than it otherwise would be. So it's sort of like you push yourself as hard as possible to to the point where actually to give any more would make, you know, the total amount of happiness in the world less. I think people might have different thresholds then, you know, like, but at the same time, you know, like, you might, you know, not really be able to give very much before you become kind of unhappy. I think even in spite of that, you should probably keep pushing because it's actually not very costly to do a lot of good. Now, it may not be. Here's the maybe the comforting part. I don't really think that you could keep up a policy of doing good for others if you're constantly in misery. You know, you would probably just shut down. So I think at the end of the day, you can only give so much that you can continue to give gladly. Like only then, I think, can you really maintain that practice. So if you keep, you know, giving up to the point where you continue to give gladly, I think, you know, you can kind of maintain the practice. But at the same time, I also think you should push yourself, you know, test your limits. Don't assume like, oh no, you know, if I give, you know, only $5 more, I won't be happy, and, you know, I can't continue, you know, this way. You know. No, just give the $5 and see what, you know, see if it really, you know, destroys you, and I'm sure it won't. Thank you. Yeah, DJ.
So, thank you for the lecture, and thank you for all the lectures that I attended, even though I did really well. And no, this is not a complaint towards that particular morning. And I'm so sorry that many of us are underdressed as compared to you today. Yeah, I kind of showed up.
I didn't really, well, I looked in my closet and I'm like, oh my God, I dress like a bum.
Yes. I guess my question was kind of building on Sydney's question. I'm asking more of practical recommendations from you.
Yeah.
I think it's very easy for us to sink into a mood whereby let me be concerned with myself. You know, my life, my well-being, my happiness, my pursuits. At the end of the day, I don't really have much energy or time or effort to care about others.
Yeah.
Is there any way that we can elevate ourselves out of this selfish mentality?
Yeah. Yeah, you can just, I guess you can change your mentality just by changing your behavior. So there are a number of really fascinating studies about the psychological impact of charitable behavior. And it's found that people who report, you know, doing more charity, well, there are a bunch of different studies, but one basic study is it just compares people who donate more and people who donate less. And it's found that the people who donate more are actually much happier by their own reports than people who donate less. And the differences are really quite dramatic. So, you know, in order for a person to acquire like the level of happiness that a person who donates a lot of money already enjoys, you would need to give them like a $10,000 a year raise or something like that, something like really incredible. And there have also been other studies where people are forced, you know, in a way to give, so they're given money and then they're forced to sort of give it away to help somebody. And it's actually found that they don't resent that, actually, that they end up getting more satisfaction from that, and they report more satisfaction from that than people who are allowed to keep, you know, this windfall gain, sort of this pride. So I think, you know, there's an assumption that having more for yourself will actually bring you more happiness. It's like the reward, the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. And I think maybe that's just based on a very flawed understanding of human nature, maybe that we are, you know, social creatures, and that we actually gain happiness from doing, you know, more for others. And so the way to change that mentality is just to try it and see how it makes you feel. And if these studies are right, it'll make you feel great. So good.
buffet dinners every night and be happy, mindlessly pursuing material wealth, material pursuits.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, I might not be truly happy. So what comprises true happiness?
Yeah. Well, I think it would take a psychologist to answer that. As well as it should be. I'm not one of these people who thinks, Socrates unsatisfied is happier than a pig satisfied. Like, I think happiness is just the way it feels. Okay. It is just, desire satisfied. Like, I don't think there's anything more deep and profound about it. I think that at the same time, there are truths about what brings more of that than what activities brings more of that happiness than other things. I think you're right. Like, just eating at a buffet, just watching Netflix all the time. Well, it'll give you some happiness, but as a matter of fact, I don't think it would give you as profound happiness as reading great literature, talking to people about interesting topics, playing music. There's a reason that these activities have flourished in human societies, all across history, all across the world. And that's that people really find them really, really satisfying. So give it a shot. You might, even though it's more difficult, it's I think gonna in the end bring you more happiness. And it's not just happiness for yourself, though. It's also happiness for all sentient beings. And that's another source of value. Okay? If you think that you have reason to pursue your own happiness, I don't see why there's no reason then to pursue the happiness of another creature, because they have the ability to suffer, they have the ability to flourish just as you do. And your happiness, your well-being is the root of some kind of value. So is the happiness of others.
Oh, I was just thinking. I must have been thinking very hard with my face. No, I was just thinking. I had the same question, and then I realized you had really answered that question in your points, in that when you die, your suffering ends, and so there are no more problems for you. But if you care about the suffering of others, like your family, and then according to this quotation that you gave, well, essentially all sentient beings, we are no different, better or less than any others, and therefore we have to extrapolate our caring about our family would be the caring about all sentient beings. That answers the question, what we do with our time and our energy is easing suffering. Whether it is suffering by giving money, suffering by saying hello to someone maybe blue you don't even know. So they can be in all kinds of small ways. I noticed you talk about giving money away, but there are tiny little ways that you can acknowledge people and maybe tiny bits of suffering all the time. And it's just acknowledgement, a smile, I don't know, welfare packs. What you guys do this really well, actually, in thinking about one another. And so you just extend that to the one another's that you don't know.
Yeah, and that's why I say, you face ethical questions all the time, because you always have an opportunity to ease suffering, even in the tiniest ways. So, you always face the question of, well, what can I do to ease suffering? You can really do a lot. You can do, small things that may have a small impact, but you can also do small things like donate small amounts of money to charity that have a massive impact.
So my question for you is, what do you do to end the suffering for other people if you're suffering?
What do you do to end
If you're suffering.
Well, if you're suffering.
If you're suffering. I think sometimes
Yeah.
that becomes a question that we have in our days because we're having a poopy day.
Yeah.
You know, I had flunked my test
Yeah.
and I'm suffering, and all of a sudden your ability to see beyond your own
Yeah.
suffering maybe causes suffering.
Yeah. No, for sure. I don't want to give you the impression that, you know, your own suffering doesn't matter. Like, you know, or it's selfish to be concerned about your own suffering. Your own suffering is suffering just like anyone else's. It's bad just like anyone else's. So you should attend to that just like you should attend to anyone else's. And you're right, you know, your own suffering can cause a great deal of suffering in others as well, people who care about you. So you do have reasons to tend to yourself, of course. You're no less real than others. But, you know, I think it's easier to point that out to people, like, oh, your suffering is real, your suffering is bad. And, you know, everybody gets that, but they don't make the leap to see that the suffering of others is just as real. And we have just as good reason to prevent that as well.
With that, I think we've come to the end of the second USB series for the lectures. And on behalf of the USB AGA, I think I would like to thank everybody for taking the time out of your busy schedules to come here and sit for the lecture. And once again, I think another round of applause is in order for